Hello. So there's a lot of interest around habits lately. You may have heard about atomic habits or tiny habits or stacking habits, or maybe you've read the classic 7 Habits of Highly Successful People by Stephen Covey. But when it comes to the church, what habits do you think are important for pastoral leaders? So I'd like to share some of my research from the Divine Pulse Project from the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research out of Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. And as part of the overall Divine Pulse Project, Greatness in Canadian Congregations is a qualitative research study exploring church growth through the lens of Jim Collins' Good to Great principles as outlined in his best-selling book. A total of 31 semi-structured interviews were conducted with pastoral leaders across Canada, across community sizes, and across Christian faith traditions to learn what it means to be a great church in Canada. And as I talked to Canadian pastoral leaders, one of the questions I asked them was this: as you look over your years of ministry, what habits have you established that you are grateful for? And this question addresses the flywheel concept that Jim Collins talks about. Collins found that growing businesses practice the slow and steady approach. They weren't waiting for that one big lucky break to suddenly spin them into success. Instead, it's a picture of a flywheel. You keep pushing and moving the flywheel just a little bit at a time, and then eventually the flywheel builds momentum and takes off on its own. So what habits are most important to pastoral leaders? The first one was patience. This was a prominent theme that came up repeatedly throughout the interviews. Leaders were grateful that they had cultivated patience in a number of areas. When they first arrived at a new congregation, for example, they were glad that they did not demand that things be changed immediately. Instead, they observed and listened and then slowly changed the focus from maintaining the status quo to actively pursuing something new. Antoine from Quebec said, "I always, when I come to a church, I try to do like they do. I don't want to arrive and to change everything and like everything you did in the past is wrong." He said, "I want to adapt first." Brian from Ontario said, "I always want to be listening and opening to other people's ideas rather than saying, I've got a plan." So there's also this continued willingness to listen and learn from the congregation. Even though as a new pastor they may want to rush ahead with some great ideas, they slow down and get to know the congregation and what's happening there. There's also a sense of patience in terms of learning how to have conversation with one another. Maria from BC spoke of learning together as a congregation how to speak with Christ's love in Christ's light. Advocating for a Socratic dialogue method, this idea of learning how to ask good questions. And she says their congregation is learning how to speak with one another in a way that honors God and each other. And of course, this is an art that isn't learned overnight. There's patience involved with adopting a new habit of conversation. Patience was also mentioned in terms of taking the time to know their church story. Sophia says from BC that there are seasons of church life that are really arduous and sacrificial because you're spending into the future. And then there are seasons when you're reaping. Realizing which season you are in requires a sort of patience to simply be in the season you're in while trusting that the next season is coming. So patience was the first good habit. The second good habit was intentionality. Pastoral leaders talked about being glad they were intentional about church structure, financial management, and specific programs. So one pastor from the prairies was very intentional about addressing an organizational flaw in their church structure. The improved org chart could have been seen, he says, as a silly little thing or kind of boring. But he said, we are a much, much healthier church now. And there's a new kind of clarity that has resulted in more trust. And he says, some really good energy. Another pastor from Ontario, they were very glad that they had practiced prudent financial management and that they had intentionally remained fairly right-sized, he says, when it came to building and budget. So this was an important habit for them. And then Cameron from Atlantic Canada spoke about purposefully having Celebrate Recovery as one of their ministries because it changed their church culture. causing it to be more honest and authentic. People say that this church feels real. And he says that this ministry has transformed their church from being a just shake my hand and have a nice day kind of church to a can you pray for me kind of church. And intentionality seems to involve a clarity of vision, being able to notice things and then taking concrete steps to either correct something or to fan something further into flame. So in conclusion, from the interviews with Canadian Christian pastoral leaders are grateful for incorporating these two habits into their leadership as they pursue the mission of the church. Patience, which involves listening and adopting a posture of learning, and intentionality, which involves discerning perception and decisive action. So, as you think about patience and intentionality, what role have these habits played in your life as a ministering person? Or maybe you see the need for these habits, and the question is how can you cultivate these habits more in your life and ministry? Thank you.